Good morning, and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church is founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, then you are probably in the right place. So before we get going, I would like to just make an announcement that today after church at 3 o'clock, there are board games, and that's going to be at the Wayward Coffee House on 65th and Roosevelt, right? Roosevelt, yeah. So everyone is invited to that. The way we do it is the members ourselves give the talk, and then we have our discussion afterwards. Yes?
Next week is the University Street Fair.
Next week is the University Street Fair, and we want to give you a heads up because they do charge for parking during the University Street Fair. I think it's $10.
$10 for 2 hours, 20 for all day.
Okay, $10 for 2 hours, 20 for all day. So either plan, if you don't want to do that, you might come early and then try to find parking, or you might just pay and plan to go to the street fair after church. Either way. And also, we fund the meetings by member donation, so there is a donation jar on the back of the room, or you can do it at seattleatheist.church. For those of you who do give donations, we greatly appreciate it. We use it mostly just to pay for the room. All right, without further ado, thank you. Come on up.
All right, hey everybody, my name is Ryan, and today we're going to talk about democracy. I read a book called Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government. And it was pretty interesting. And it was published in 2016 by Christopher Atchin and Larry Bartels. So raise your hand if you think democracy is perfect. Exactly. So there are flaws. And this book aims to address those flaws, and not trying to say that democracy is bad. It's trying to say there are inherent problems that perhaps we can aim to fix. So I'm going to be taking us through the highlights of the book. Essentially, the book's last chapter was perfect because it summarized everything for me. And I'll be mostly going through that, an edited version of that, because it sums up everything that they were trying to say. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the main concepts. So, in the conventional view, democracy begins with the voters. Ordinary people have preferences about what their government should do. They choose leaders who will do those things, or they enact their preferences directly in referendums. In either case, what the majority wants becomes government policy, a highly attractive prospect in the light of most human experience with governments. Democracy makes the people the rulers, and legitimacy drives from their consent. Unfortunately, while the folk theory of democracy has flourished as an ideal, its credibility has been severely undercut by a growing body of scientific evidence presenting a different and considerably darker view of democratic politics. That evidence demonstrates that the great majority of citizens pay little attention to politics. At election time, they are swayed by how they feel about the nature of the times, especially the current state of the economy, and by political loyalties typically acquired in childhood. Those loyalties, not the facts of political life and government policy, are the primary drivers of political behavior. Election outcomes turn out to be largely random events from the viewpoint of contemporary democratic theory. That is, elections are well determined by powerful forces, but those forces are not the ones that current theories of democracy believe should determine how elections come out. Hence, the old frameworks will no longer do. And so, diving in to the last chapter. So they'll reference things that they've discussed sometimes. I've tried to cut most of it out. But essentially, They dive in the chapters to some of these concepts in great detail, where they're going to summarize it. We can talk about that after if there's more questions. Okay, so proponents of democracy have long thought that human dignity required self-government. People should choose their leaders at the polls and hold them accountable. Voters should be represented, not just governed. The argument for democracy supposed that good citizens would engage in thoughtful monitoring of their government. Why is democracy the best form of government? When the question has been asked, platitudes have generally sufficed as answers. Proponents of democracy have seldom found hard-nosed critics scrutinizing their logic and evidence. For more than a century after the rise of mass democracy, skeptical commentators pointed out gaps between romanticized democracy theory and the actual workings of democracy. Defenses of the conventional faith generally predominate in both popular and scholarly conversation. Those defenses, never very plausible to begin with, are by now in tatters. Few scholars of political behavior take them seriously as an empirical count of democracy. However, many thinkers implicitly or explicitly continue to embrace the folk theory as a normative benchmark, and a few draw the seemingly logical conclusion that a new and distinctively different theory is needed. The assumptions underlying the folk theory of democracy are very stringent. Can ordinary people, busy with their lives and with no first-hand experience of policy making or public administration, do what the theory expects them to do? Can they formulate policy preferences, assess where candidates stand on issues, set aside cognitive biases and group prejudices, and then choose a candidate who embodies an uplifting version of their own policy views? Can human nature meet those demands? The answer is that real people are not much like citizens imagined by the folk theory. Numerous studies have demonstrated that most residents of democratic countries have little interest in politics and do not follow news of public affairs beyond browsing the headlines. They do not know the details of even salient policy debates. They do not have a firm understanding of what the political parties stand for, and they often vote for parties whose long-standing issue positions are at odds with their own. Mostly they identify with ethnic, racial, occupational, religious, or other sorts of groups, and often, whether through group ties or hereditary loyalties, with a political party. Even the more attentive citizens mostly adopt the policy positions of the parties as their own. They are mirrors of the parties, not masters. For most citizens, most of the time, party and group loyalties are the primary drivers of vote choices. I skipped over a few kind of more cryptic ones. They talk about spatial theory of democracy, the cues theory, but for our purposes, we can talk about those later if you want. So the main problem with this defense of democracy is that the partisanship often has little real ideological content. As we have seen, while most voters do have at least a few more or more or less strongly held issue preferences, those preferences rarely cohere into consistent ideological positions. Nor need they neatly match the platform of any particular party. Most important, citizens choose parties for reasons unrelated to ideology. As a result, the policies espoused by political parties are routinely at odds with the preferences of the people who vote for them, even after partisan loyalists adjust some of their ideas to match those of their party. Whatever it is that partisan loyalties represent, it is mostly not ideological or issue congruence. The parties represent their voters. If they do, it's in some quite different ways. Partisanship arises because a party presided over an economic recovery from a devastating depression, or because the party embodies bonds of racial or ethnic or class solidarity, or simply because we have been taught since childhood that a particular party represents people like us. Issue congruence between parties and their voters, insofar as it exists, is largely a byproduct of the other connections, most of them lacking policy content. And they go on to talk about deliberative theory, which we're going to skip. It's another interesting one. So while political theories grounded in misguided assumptions about human nature are usually of little practical import, the dispute over the folk theory and its alternatives is not just an academic squabble. The folk theory has also structured how everyday citizens and important political figures have understood American government and American ideals. In consequence, foolish reform movements have relied on its teachings, giving us flat earth pronouncements about how government should work. The results in American politics, excessive reliance on referendums at the state level, and the dilution of the influence of knowledgeable party officials in the choice of presidential candidates have strengthened the hand of narrow interest groups and often resulted in self-defeating choices by the electorate. We argued, for example, that the voters' choices made a mess of car insurance, damaged their child's dental health, and even let homes burn down. And these are things that they went into in more detail. In the same way, every presidential's primary season exposes the danger of voter fatigue with familiar, experienced politicians and their enthusiasm for hopelessly unqualified but clever demagogues known only from a few television appearances. As we have seen, effective democracy requires an appropriate balance between popular preferences and elite expertise. The point of reform should not simply be to maximize popular influence in the political process, but to facilitate more effective popular influence. We need to learn to let political parties and political leaders do their jobs too. Simple-minded attempts to thwart or control political elites through initiatives, direct primaries, and term limits will often be counterproductive. Mountains of evidence have accumulated establishing the limitations of people's thinking about political issues and ideology. From the viewpoint of the naive folk theory, it is all quite depressing. In consequence, contemporary scholars of public opinion and electoral politics have sought to rethink the role of citizens in democratic systems. Many of them have turned to evaluations of political leaders and governmental performance as the primary basis of ordinary citizens' political thinking and behavior. The resulting theory of retrospective voting offers more scope for the political leadership than the conventional populist theory does, and it takes more realistic account of the limits of citizens' political knowledge. It requires only that the voter knows whether times have been good or bad under the current administration. If times have been good, voters should re-elect the incumbents. If times have been bad, voters should throw the bums out. So they're talking about retrospective voting, which means you just look at what happened in the past and then decide whether they were good or bad. But we're going to go into why this doesn't quite work out. Okay, so however, for this mechanism to work effectively, voters must do two things well. First, they must be able to discern the specific role of government's diligence and competence in producing the pain or pleasure they experience. Punishing the incumbents for events beyond their control makes no more sense than kicking the dog to get back at a difficult boss at work. And second, they must be able to evaluate sensibly whether times have been good or bad under the incumbent government. This may sound simple, but it is not. Citizens are unlikely to know whether crime has gone up or down, only whether gruesome murders appear in the local news. Their judgments about the seriousness of environmental threats are virtually uncorrelated with those of experts. Hence, citizens routinely fail in both of these respects. Governments are punished willy-nilly for bad times, including bad times clearly due to the events beyond the government's control. As an example, voters along the Jersey Shore punished the incumbent President Woodrow Wilson for the panic and economic dislocation stemming from a dramatic series of shark attacks in 1916, reducing his vote share by as much as 10%. Wilson was not responsible for the shark attacks. There was nothing he or his administration could have done to prevent them. Remediation in the form of disaster assistance or unemployment benefits would have required legislation, bureaucratic capacity, and a conception of the role of government that did not exist at the time, yet the voters punished anyway. These findings suggest that voters have great difficulty making sensible attributions of responsible for hard times. However, it is still more troubling to find that voters have a great difficulty simply assessing whether times have been good or bad over the course of an incumbent's term in office. We found that the voters are extremely sensitive to income growth in the months leading up to the elections. The downside of sensitivity to short-term income growth is a remarkable insensitivity to long-term economic performance. Our analysis indicated that the income growth before the election year had a little effect on the incumbent party's prospects at the polls. Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election was punished for an election year recession, despite considerable economic growth earlier in his term. Ronald Reagan in 1984 was re-elected in a landslide thanks to an election year boom, despite lackluster growth earlier in his term. So because economic conditions fluctuate substantially over time, this myopic quirk in voters' assessments of economic performance induces substantial randomness in electoral rewards and punishments, in the sense that voters will reward and punish for reasons unrelated to competence. One implication is that voters are unlikely to succeed in selecting competent economic managers, and indeed we find no evidence that their assessments of incumbent administrations predict subsequent economic performance. Another implication is that myopic voters are unlikely to succeed in motivating incumbents to pursue sustained economic growth, since there is little electoral payoff for growth outside of the election year. And indeed, we do find a substantial electoral cycle in economic performance, with real income growth peaking in election years and falling substantially after polls close. In ordinary times, the foibles we have identified in retrospective voting significantly hamper prospects for effective political accountability. That is a substantial blow to the view that retrospection might provide an attractive alternative to the populist understanding of elections. So that was kind of a more detailed run through on retrospective voting, democracy models that they build. I've cut out most of the others because they're just trying to disprove most of them. Okay. So, academic theorists of democracy sometimes dismiss the retrospective theory of political accountability as a hopelessly thin and uninspiring account of democracy. Our concern is different, that it simply does not work. Our analyses cast profound doubt on retrospective voting as a reliable basis for good government. Thus, the retrospective theory of democracy will not bear the normative weight that its enthusiastic proponents want to place on it. Voters indeed find retrospective judgment easier than sophisticated ideological reasoning, but not easy enough. Where does this leave the current state of democracy theory, or democratic theory? The short answer is in shambles. All the conventional defenses of democratic government are at odds with this demonstrable, centrally important facts of political life. One has to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast to take real comfort in any of them. Some of the standard defenses romanticize human nature, some mathematize it, and others boulderize it. But they all have one thing in common. They do not portray human beings realistically, nor take honest account of our human limitations. For democratic theorists, that is the central challenge. Human beings are not angels. We care more about ourselves than the common good, and we are prone to faction. Factions are visible in group attachments of all kinds: kinship, ethnic, racial, religious, occupational, and national, and they are powerful in political life. Contemporary understandings of identity in politics have reinforced and deepened this long-standing intellectual tradition of seeing people as embedded in human groups that are meaningful to them. When people define themselves in terms of one of these categories, they have an identity. The most important factions in politics are the parties, and they are central to any realistic view of electoral politics. We have argued that voters choose political parties first and foremost in order to align themselves with the appropriate coalition of social groups. Most citizens support a party not because they have carefully calculated that its policy positions are closest to their own, but rather because their kind of person belongs to that party. When people are asked what they like and dislike about political parties, or what characterizes the different parties, they often talk about perceived ties between the parties and prominent social groups. In interviews, citizens sound more ideological and conventionally rational than our description of them would suggest. The fact has led some scholars, particularly those who do fieldwork with extensive personal interviews, to suppose that somehow all the other scientific evidence is misleading. People make good sense, just listen to them. Alas, the apparent rationality is itself often misleading. Citizens tend to adopt the views of the parties and groups they favor. If they are unusually highly engaged in politics, they may even develop ideological frameworks rationalizing their group loyalties and denigrating those of their political opponents. The reasoned explanations they provide for their own beliefs and behavior are often just post hoc justifications of their social or partisan loyalties. Well-informed citizens are likely to have more elaborate and internally consistent worldviews than inattentive people do, but that just reflects the fact that their rationalizations are better rehearsed. The task of being a good citizen by the standards of conventional democratic theory is too hard for everyone. The historical record leaves little doubt that the educated, including the highly educated, have gone astray in their moral and political judgments as often as anyone else. In the antebellum era, prominent Southern professors and university administrators often defended slavery. Brilliant 19th century German professors helped give shape to German nationalism and the racial identity theories that led to Nazism. Crude prejudices against Catholics, Jews, and others was common among American intellectuals until recent decades. Of course, a great many other people in each of these countries made the same or other equally appalling judgments. The point is simply that it does not follow because an individual knows Greek or mathematics, is an architect, a veterinarian, a doctor, or a barrister, that he is endowed with a special intelligence of social questions. Were the electorate solely composed of persons stuffed with sciences, their votes would be no better than those emitted at present. Gifted in their own spheres, artists and intellectuals have no special expertise in politics. In our political judgments and actions, we all must make mistakes, sometimes even morally indefensible errors. Thus, when we say that voters routinely err, we mean all voters. How then do elections actually work? Political campaigns consist in large part of reminding voters of their partisan identities, mobilizing them to support their group at the polls. Formal communications by the groups and informal communications networks among group members also help citizens understand how their identity groups connect to the candidates and parties. In consequence, the majority of Democrats and Republicans consistently support their party in each election. As the first American political science, Francis Lubert, observed long ago, political parties teach us what to think about politics much more often than we teach them. The specific circumstances of a given election may occasionally inspire significant defectors from the standing partisan loyalties, but those two often reflect the heightened salience of specific religious, racial, or gender identities, rather than one voter's issue preferences. Many self-described independents disdain party labels, but admit to leaning towards one party or the other. They are subject to many of the same forces and end up acting more or less like partisans at the polls. The result is that, from the viewpoint of governmental representativeness and accountability, election outcomes are essentially random choices among the available parties. Elections that throw the bums out typically do not produce genuine policy mandates, not even when they are landslides. They simply put a different elite coalition in charge. This bloodless change of government is a great deal better than bloody revolution, but it is not deliberative policy change. The parties have policy views that and carry them out when in office, but most voters are not listening, or are simply thinking what their party tells them they should be thinking. This is what an honest view of electoral democracy looks like. It is a blunder to expect elections to deliver more. Issue congruence is not the heart and soul of democratic representation. Rather, voters primarily look for politicians who match their identities. If we are right about that, then the correlation should be powerful between the identities of politicians and the identities of their electorates. In contemporary American politics, perhaps the most powerful social identity is race. Thus, our argument implies that heavily African American districts will elect African Americans and heavily white districts will elect white representatives. And they should do so nearly all the time. Indeed, they do. In 2014 to 2015, U.S. House of Representatives, for example, 98% of the districts with black majorities elected black representatives. Conversely, just 5% of the districts with white majorities elected African Americans. This overwhelming correlation provides a powerful illustration of the importance of identity congruence in electoral politics. To be successful, popular movements need a crisis, blind retrospection, and a message that plays to the identity and self-understanding of a substantial group in the population. The comforting view that there was something particularly evil about Germans and the rest of us are immune will always have appeal for some. In truth, however, the desire for a strong leader who can identify domestic enemies and who promises to do something about them without worrying over much about legalities, those germs mutated to fit the particular local subcultures are latent in every democratic electorate, waiting for sufficiently widespread human suffering to provide conditions for their explosive spread. Okay. Having argued that the most prominent popular and scholarly intellectual defenses of democracy are incompatible with the empirical evidence, we can easily imagine some irritated readers asking pointedly, well, would you rather live in a dictatorship? The answer, for the record, is no. We too are inspired and heartened when a government of torturers collapses, when the Berlin Wall comes down, or when an unarmed young man faces down a tank during the Tiananmen demonstrations in China. But what does not make our argument any less persuasive, this does not make our argument any less persuasive. It merely demonstrates the actual democratic process, that actual democratic processes have quite real practical virtues, unrelated to the idealistic virtues ascribed to them in the folk theory of democracy. Proponents of the folk theory faced with its unrealism often fall back on Winston Churchill's pragmatic argument that contemporary democratic procedures are generally better than anything else we've tried. We agree with this assessment, but if the folk theory cannot account for the pragmatic successes of democratic politics, other factors must make the difference. But what other factors? Getting a clear picture of why democracy is a good political system, what it does or doesn't accomplish, which features and processes are essential to its success, which are not, and how it could be made to work more fairly, seems important as an intellectual challenge, a practical guide, and an ethical imperative. An independent judiciary, freedom of speech and assembly, and other features of democratic institutions and culture are undoubtedly important. But our primary focus here is on the central mechanism in the folk theory of democracy, elections. In our view, the most concrete and potentially important benefits of elections are not those envisioned in the folk theory. First and perhaps most obviously, elections generally provide authoritative, widely accepted agreement about who should rule. Moreover, in well-functioning democratic systems, parties that win office are inevitably defeated at a subsequent election. They may be defeated more or less randomly due to droughts, floods, and untimely economic slums, but they are defeated nonetheless. Moreover, voters seem increasingly likely to reject the incumbent party the longer it has held office, reinforcing the tendency for government power to change hands. This turnover is a key indicator of democratic health and stability. It implies that one group or coalition can become entrenched in power, It implies that no one group can become entrenched in power, unlike in dictatorships or one-party states, whose power is often exercised persistently by a single privileged segment of society. And because the loser in each election can reasonably expect the wheel of political fortune to turn in the not-too-distant future, they are more likely to accept the outcome than to take to the streets. Electoral competition also provides some incentives for rulers at any given moment to tolerate opposition. The notion that citizens can oppose the incumbent rulers and organize to replace them, yet remain loyal to the nation, is fundamental both to real democracy and to social harmony. Unfortunately, even many citizens in well-functioning democracies fail to see the importance of organized political opposition. Freedom is to faction what air is to fire, but ordinary citizens often dislike the conflict and bickering that comes with the freedom. They wish their elected officials would just do the people's work without so much squabbling amongst themselves. They dislike the compromises that result when many different groups are free to propose alternative policies, leaving politicians to adjust their differences. Voters want a real leader, not a politician, by which they generally mean that their own ideas should be adopted and that others' people's disregarded. because views different from their own are so obviously self-interested and erroneous. To the contrary, politicians with vision who are also skilled at creating compromise are the soul of successful democracy, and they exemplify real leadership. But this way of thinking about leadership is not taught in schools. Finally, re-election-seeking politicians in well-functioning democracies will strive to avoid being caught violating consensual ethical norms in their society. As Key put it, public opinion in a democracy establishes vague limits of permissiveness with which government action may occur without arising a commotion. Thus, no president will strangle a kitten on the White House lawn in view of television cameras. Easily managed government tasks will get taken care of too. Openly taking bribes will generally be punished. So long as a free press can report dubious goings-on and literate public can learn about them, politicians have strong incentives to avoid doing what is widely despised. Violations occur, of course, but they are expensive. Removal from the office is likely. By contrast, in dictatorships, moral or financial corruption is more common because public outrage has no obvious organized outlet. Thus, it should come as no surprise that the real benefits of democracy are mostly quite different from those envisioned in the folk theory of democracy. They are real benefits nonetheless, and constitute a substantial, albeit limited, argument in favor of democratic systems compared to their authoritarian alternatives. However, they do little to answer the broader questions of whether and how everyday democratic policymaking promotes people's interests when they are judging politicians on entirely different grounds. If we are correct in claiming that group ties and social identities are the most important bases of political commitments and behavior, and that election outcomes have little real policy content, what are the implications for democracy and democratic theory? Once the folk theory and retrospective voting theory are disregarded, the answer is not obvious. The optimistic notion that policy making is sharply constrained by public preferences runs aground on the fact that the pressures from parties, interest groups, and the wealthy routinely trump broad left-leaning majorities on issues like the minimum wage and social spending, while pressures from parties, interest groups, and educated elites trump broad right-leaning majorities on issues like silent prayer in schools and parental notification for minors seeking an abortion. In every society, policy making is a job for specialists. Policies are made by political elites of one kind or another, including elected officials, government bureaucrats, interest groups, and judges. Politics has been and is always will be carried out by politicians, just as art is carried out by artists, engineering by engineers, business by businessmen. One need not spend much time in Washington, D.C. or any other capital city of a democracy to learn that for the great majority of issues that the government decides, no ordinary citizens are actually involved in the government and the policy-making process. Descriptions of the actual policy-making process return repeatedly to the same concepts: power and influence. Some officials, groups, and organizations are powerful, others are not. As classic studies of the policy-making process have emphasized, the resulting differences between them in getting their way are enormous. Sheer group size helps, but wealth, social prestige, and access to media of communication and persuasion often bring about greater power, both in their own right and as resources facilitating organization. In the folk theory and in retrospective voting models, every citizen is equal by assumption. Voting is supposed to equalize power. The rich and the poor all have one vote apiece. They can listen to the arguments and vote their interests equally well. But as we have shown, that naive view flies in the face of a great deal of social scientific evidence. If voters are to have their interests represented in the policy-making process, then interest groups and parties have to do the work. And the organizations representing different interests have to have power in their policy-making process proportional to the presence in the electorate. The rich, the well-placed, and the well-organized cannot have extra power to advance their interests. But from a broader perspective, taking the psychology underlying the group theory of democracy seriously might lead to quite different normative conclusions. Giving groups of ordinary voters some of what they want may not always be so desirable if what they want is a byproduct of effective tribal loyalties. A more compelling normative assessment will require a clearer empirical understanding of how group politics works. At present, normative thinking about democracy and democratic reform is hopelessly entangled with the unrealistic empirical assumptions of the folk theory. Getting closer to the end, I know it's long. One of the most deleterious consequences of adherence to the unrealistic ideas about democracy is that it keeps us from seeing what a truer and deeper democracy would be like. Like the default assumption among proponents of the folk theory has long been that the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. New thinking about both ideals and realities will be required if democracies are to become truly more democratic. Our account of group politics points to a variety of potentially significant reforms, but we will focus on just one here. In our view, more effective democracy would require a greater degree of economic and social equality. The most powerful players in the policy game are the educated, the wealthy, and the well-connected. Corporations have more clout than the workers, major media outlets are more powerful than independent bloggers, affluent citizens' views matters more than those of the poor, and members of ethnic and racial majority groups are policy winners more often than the members of minorities. Whether we assess the influence of the poor and minorities in terms of their expressed preferences or their apparent interests, the power imbalances are very large, and the resulting policy outcomes are far from those implied by any appealing democratic ideal. The theory of group politics provides a clear explanation for why a more egalitarian society would result in a more egalitarian political process. The result would be an increase in the real political power of a variety of currently underrepresented groups, not all of them approved by the editorial pages of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. The policy views of both corporate interests and college professors would get less weight in a fairer process. The problem, of course, is how to accomplish such a change. At the moment, Americans lack the ideas, the will, and the political organization. Protest groups come along regularly, but because their political thinking is so bound up in the folk theory of democracy, they resist the leadership, organization, and coalition building that would give them clout and staying power. They quickly fade, leaving everything else much as it was. A somewhat less daunting aim would be simply to reduce the most direct effects of existing differences in wealth in the democratic process. Rich people, large corporations, and business associations everywhere spend considerable sums financing political campaigns and lobbying them between elections. But few established democracies do as little as the United States does to limit the distorting effects of money in the democratic process. Congress has made periodic attempts to regulate lobbying and campaign contributions, usually in ways that tend to protect the interests of incumbent politicians regardless of party or ideology, but sometimes in ways that would have helped level the playing field. However, in recent years, conservative majorities in the Supreme Court could have increasingly employed the 19th century liberalism's logic that buying elections is a form of free speech, and therefore protected under the Constitution, to gut restrictions on political contributions. Most of the time, the big contributors are Republicans, and so this set of rules advantages the Republican Party, causing a predictable enthusiasm for the undemocratic status quo in that party. But the biases are not unique to Republicans. Because money, access, and intensity matter, both parties, and for that matter, most political groups, privilege the affluent relative to the poor, sophisticated insiders relative to the ordinary people, and intense minorities relative to the more complacent and inattentive majorities. Those biases grease the squeaking wheels and help minimize protest. But reducing the influence of money in American elections is a clear implication of the vision of democracy we have set out. Thinking of campaign spending as free speech is naive when it is not disingenuous. Government remains an all-too-human enterprise, not so different from business, religion, education, and every other aspect of public life. But misleading theories are not neutral, and they are not costless. current thinking about democracy, bad ideas dominate public discourse. Romantic notions of democracy sound good and have emotion on their side. Let the people rule. Generations of thoughtful Americans have promoted with genuine sincerity reforms deriving from the folk theory of democracy. At the moment, America is a democracy, but is not very democratic. Democratic citizens, all of us, have to think differently. All too often, we bring rose-colored glasses when we look at democracy, glasses handed to us from the dead hands of Enlightenment thinkers. In consequence, we not only propose bad solutions, often enough, we cannot even see the problems. The gross inequalities of political power in contemporary America are the most obvious instance. We recognize that the view of democracy offered in this book is less cheery than the romantic alternatives, and thus less appealing, at least initially. Nevertheless, just as critical step towards democracy occurred when the people lost faith in the notion that the king has been anointed by God, we believe that abandoning the folk theory of democracy is a prerequisite to both greater intellectual clarity and real political change. Too many democratic reformers have squandered their energy on misguided or quixotic ideas. Further political and social progress will require thinking more clearly about the contributions and limits of citizens, groups, and political parties in the actual process of government. And that's it.